good day, and a very warm welcome to our viewers and everyone in the Queer Reflections studio. My name is Yasmin Siyama, and I'll be your host for today. First, let me welcome you all to a series of conversations related to the lived realities of queer Muslims. Today, we have on the Queer Reflections studios, Akila Pillay.
I am the secretary on the board of Al-Ghurbaah Foundation. I'm also the chairperson of the Women's Safe Space Committee. And currently I'm in my second years of Masters at UCT. I am pursuing Masters in Islam, Gender and Sexuality at UCT.
My name is Al-Ghurbaah and I am a high school English teacher.
I'm George Rose. I'm Catholic by faith. I'm an LGBTQI as well as GBV activist.
I'm Imam Muxtin Hendricks and I am an Islamic scholar and I'm also the executive director at the Al-Ghurbaah Foundation.
Today we are going to be talking about re-engaging Islam through the lens of queer Muslim experiences. What was it like for you?
For myself, it was extremely uncomfortable, it was difficult, and the experiences around it was very complex. I grew up in a very orthodox Muslim household, and I was exposed to a very orthodox Islamic community, a Muslim community that instilled beliefs into me that homosexuality and Islam were incompatible. And at some point I internalized that to the point that I actually convinced myself that I could not be Muslim and lesbian at the same time. And that was really harsh on me because I did not know how to cope with two identities that I felt that was me, but then I had to choose between the two. I unfortunately developed an eating disorder, and I experienced a lot of suicidal tendencies. And I remember there was a time where I just prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take away my desires for same sex.
The disconnect between spirituality and sexuality took me a number of years, coming out thrice, 18, 28, and at 38 I eventually said to my parents, this is it, I am queer, I'm not going to be. And the difficulty then came, I was now going to let my conscience dictate my way forward in faith and not be guided by the rules of the church. So we stood in stark contrast, myself and the church. The effects that disconnect had for me was deep depression, to the point that I ended up in a psychiatric clinic. So yeah, it's a disconnect which one doesn't want to have.
We don't ask for it.
Exactly.
I can absolutely relate a lot to what Akila has especially said. If I think back to my childhood, I knew from a very young age that I was gay, and that I was, or at least that I was different from everyone else. But I didn't see when I was a child, I didn't see that there was anything wrong with it. To such an extent that I actually prayed to God when I was younger for God for Allah to kind of connect me with another person of the same gender. It was only much later when I became a teenager and when in society, when I started getting bullied by children at school for like my thin voice, and when my uncles started speaking to me about the wrongness of homosexuality, and they started mocking other males in my family. That subconsciously, of course, told me that I needed to fit in with what was expected of me.
At some point, I told myself that I'm either Muslim or I'm lesbian. But I can't be both. So I decided that, okay, the only way to cope with the difficulties that I was experiencing was to distance myself from Islam, because the current representations of Islam back then even is that Islam and homosexuality are incompatible. So why did Allah allow me to experience all of those things to the point that I even wanted to take my life? And this is early in my childhood where I just felt empty. So eventually I just thought, okay, you know what? The best thing to do is distance myself from Islam, and this is how I should be, because there's nothing else that I can do. I felt hopeless.
In that disconnectedness, I felt like I'm lost. I've got nothing that is guiding me. Where are the principles that my life must be guided by, and the principles that the church wanted to instill and force down, and it just didn't resonate.
I would like to hear your perspective of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah from the Bible.
Well, biblically, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah has been used as a whipping stick against persons with different sexual orientation.
I think where we have gone wrong in our interpretation is, especially as Islamic scholars, is not being able to distinguish between innate homosexuality and constructed homosexuality. And somehow when it comes to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we just conflate the two. And so I think today we have a plethora of knowledge about sexual orientation and gender identity. Theories that are very well researched around what makes a person adhere to or being attached to a particular sexual orientation. And so if we look at the three cases that the Quran mentions about homosexuality, and you're absolutely right, the story is not about homosexuality. Homosexual or the constructed nature of homosexuality in that story was one of the thousands of atrocities that were committed. So it's also quite surprising that when we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, we only think homosexuality, yet there were so many other atrocities. And with all three of these incidences, it was constructed. The first one was when men used to cut off the king's highways, and they would usurp all the wealth from these caravans that used to pass through. And then they would rape these men as a way of showing dominance and humiliating them. And the reason why they did that, because they were also a xenophobic community. They didn't like foreigners to come into the country because they said, in fact, according to the Bible, that these people are just coming here to deplete our resources. So that was clearly not consensual acts of homosexuality, but constructed. And it was a crime. And it's interesting that the Quran is referring to these people as mujrimin, right? Not as sinners per se. And then the second incident is, excuse me, where we see men having orgies in the temple of Ishtar, and how that is related to the idolatrous practices and beliefs around Ishtar being the goddess of war and love and fertility. And so giving your fertility to Ishtar was then allowing Ishtar to keep your lands fertile, right? And so men engaged in this practice. Even women were supposed to give their virginity to Ishtar, and therefore temple prostitution was rife in the Babylonian period. And so again, that was constructed around the polytheistic beliefs that they had at the time. And then the final one, which is the cherry on top, is when the guest of, or the angels who was disguised as men, came as guest to Lot in the middle of the night, and Lot saying to them, you look unfamiliar, you don't even look like you're tired, and don't you know what these people do to foreigners that come into the country, into the city? And Lot then provides shelter for them, and then Lot's wife was not happy with this idea, and she then goes to the neighbor and tells the neighbor Lot is entertaining guests. And this is how, the Quran says, وَجَاءَ قَوْمُ لُوطٍ, and the entire community came to Lot's house demanding that he should give up these guests. And Lot, then being in catch-22, he wants to offer his daughters instead for this temple prostitution, because they used to come to him all the time asking, when are you going to give your daughters to the temple? And then they turn around and say, no, you know exactly what we want. We want these men to marry. So they didn't want to go and take them out for dinner. They clearly wanted to do something with these men, right? And we know that for a fact, because certain words like Adaha and Hazia that is used in the Quran clearly shows a kind of humiliation that is related to body violation, right? and so it's tantamount to rape.
Yes.
And so in all three of these cases, there's not consensual, it's not of a consensual nature. And so we can't use the story as a blanket condemnation for homosexuality. For innocent people who innately, I mean, I'm specifically thinking of your story that you just told us now, that how you just naturally felt this attraction. It's not something that at some point you woke up and you said, okay, let me try this, right? And straight people don't do that either, right? They just naturally come to realize that I'm attracted to the opposite sex. So why should it be any different for gay people, right? And so we can't draw parallels between the two, and it's such an injustice, and this is something that I want the Muslim community to understand, that it's such an injustice to an innately homosexually oriented person to use that story as a blanket condemnation.
The function of religion is that it should provide spiritual guidance and support. But here, we see examples of religion having an adverse, effect on individuals. What can we contribute on that?
It's the way that knowledge is being produced and reproduced in society. Because if you think about it, most of our Islamic knowledge while growing up, we are taught by various gatekeepers. So imams, muallimas, priests, knowledge that are passed down from these gatekeepers is powerful. It's very influential. They are building a narrative that Islam is filled with hatred, that Islam is a violent religion, and that Islam is an intolerant religion towards homosexuals. So instead of making them feel closer to Islam, we are pushing them away, which I think is so sad.
I don't think necessarily that the gatekeepers have bad intentions, but perhaps they don't have the tools to deal with these things in different ways, and so sometimes they are just perpetuating that same narrative that they were trained in the institutions. And I think that's also something that we have to think about, that maybe at some point we have to present the alternative to the gatekeepers and say, there's another way of dealing with people who are not straight.
Yeah, talking about gatekeepers, I mean, my first experience of a gatekeeper was not a pleasant experience. I was a 10-year-old boy when I was molested by the gatekeeper in our parish priest. You are the model guide here. And these are the people that we as people of faith look up to. That this is what you are doing behind closed doors.
One kind of wonders that if the story of Sodom and Gomorrah was about crime, then it's the crime that we needed to highlight, not necessarily the avenue through which that crime is being done.
Yes.
But here we see another crime that is being committed, but it seems to be okay because it's done in, it's the clergy and they hold the power and the privilege, and so we don't talk about it, we just sweep it under the carpet.
Absolutely.
And it's funny because we worried about the fact that people are homosexual and they're behaving in the manner in which they're behaving, and these gatekeepers come along and say, you know what, if you're a lesbian, for instance, you need to sleep with a man, and then you know how it is, and you will actually understand that you're not actually really homosexual. In fact, you are married, you're a Molana, and you go and sleep with a lesbian because you want to correct them. So isn't the fact that you are now committing infidelity to your wife the issue there?
They will try to convince a lesbian to sleep with a man, so that they can convert you to become straight. But then, wouldn't you say the same could be applied to heterosexuals? Because then I would say, okay, then why don't you try sleeping with, yeah, exactly, and then let's see if you can convert. But it doesn't work that way, so if it doesn't work for us, how's it going to work for you?
Exactly.
I was married to a woman for 6 years, it didn't make me straight.
Exactly.
I knew at a very early age that I was gay. I was 6 years old when I first realized that when I dressed up in my sister's fairy costume and walked out into the yard, and my dad saw that and just asked me to go and change. But so telling me that I became homosexual after I was molested by that priest That's absolute nonsense.
Your dad asking you, no, telling you to change your tire was more about because he couldn't sit with that. He felt uncomfortable, so he couldn't sit with that. It's a them problem, not a us problem. But then we sit with the consequences for years.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Or maybe you just didn't like the dress that you wore.
What we are becoming present to is that people disconnect, from organized religions and not necessarily the faith aspect or the spirituality that comes with religion. Am I justified in saying that?
Yes, you are. Because if you think about the common denominators that all of us have here, it's because of the way that we were indoctrinated. It's the way we were constructed to not just perceive ourselves, but to perceive how religion is. It has to do a lot with fear as well. Because if you think about it, many of us distance ourselves because we were afraid that if we accepted our homosexuality and we embraced our faith, we would go to hell. So it's the fear aspect that also plays a major role, but who instilled that fear in the first place? It's organized religion.
I was the firstborn male from my grandfather's line. So of his sons, I was also the firstborn male. Patriarchy didn't just affect me, it affected my father as well, because it was his responsibility in turn to ensure that I got married to someone at a very young age. When he realized that I was gay, he tried to arrange a marriage for me, and in that way, he also felt the pressure.
Has there been a time in your life, through the fact that now you're gay and all that, has there been a time or a point in your life where you actually wanted to leave Islam?
Yeah, I'm thinking back of the time when I was studying in Pakistan. And I just came later in my studies came to realize that I'm actually enrolled in the Salafi school, which is sort of the more orthodox version of Islam. And in that space, there was no, you couldn't ask questions, open questions to your teachers, you get dismissed for those kind of. And I attempted to ask about homosexuality, and it was just, that's haram. And so because of those kind of teachings, and you feel that there was no answers for you, then you start questioning, why am I still holding on to a faith or embracing a faith that doesn't embrace me back?
Yes.
And so, also just for the sake of acceptance, you don't completely leave Islam, but you disconnect from it.
Yes.
Because there was a time when I couldn't pray, and it's not that I didn't want to pray, it's just that it was like there's this God that you're supposed to love and venerate, but this is the same God that's rejecting you. Until I come to realize at a point that actually it was not God that's homophobic, it's my community that's homophobic. And then you start, getting back into that. But I think for most queer Muslims, they experience something maybe similar, where you still somehow retain some identity of being Muslim, but you kind of disconnect.
So I guess the question now is there a problem with the current representation of Islam? What is it that we can do? Do you see a problem with the way the current Islam has been given to us, how it's been represented?
Yeah, I think let's call a spade a spade. I mean, if we look at these experiences that we are having, and with many youth that I've worked with, that's, being disconnected from Islam, then you're asking the question, what aspect of Islam is it that they are disconnecting from? And then you kind of ask, can the real Islam please stand up? Because there's this need to be attached to Islam, but then also wanting to be disconnected from the parts that feel unjust. Right? And I think if we make that distinction between this is constructed by organized religion, and this is actually the values of the Quran and the principles of the Quran by which we have to live, then I think it makes it much more easier for people to say, okay, the problem is not with Islam, the problem is not with the Quran, the problem is not with God, but it's that construction of religion that becomes a problem. And often that construction of religion is serving patriarchy.
Think about the times that I've been trying to force myself to go against my innateness to what's natural to me, that doesn't feel like surrendering to me. It feels as if I'm fighting against my true self. And if Allah is the truth, then surely Allah expects me to worship Him, being my true self.
How do we remain faithful to our faith traditions or our beliefs while remaining to our true selves and our identity as queer members of the community and LGBTQI plus community, and retain our Islam or our faith?
Well, I think there's a beautiful verse in the Quran that says, وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ, that we have not revealed anything in this book unless it is for a healing and a mercy for humanity. And I think that that's where we need to go back to. Let's go back to the reinterpreting the Quran so that it becomes like a practical thing for us in the 21st century. Right? And so let's say no to those interpretations of the Quran. It doesn't provide healing, it doesn't provide mercy. And it needs to be inclusive. You can't say mercy and healing is for a particular group of people. It should be for all and sundry. And so I think it's going back to that and back to the values of Islam. I mean, if you look at prophets, for example, no prophet has come to establish a religion. They came to impart knowledge and impart values and their spiritual understandings of the world. And then people took that and created organized religion out of that. And so let's go back to these values that they came with. And we will find that when we start re-engaging with our faiths, it's those things that we need, because that's what sustains our journey as a soul, and not necessarily organized religion.
So are you saying we should perhaps come up with maybe a more compassion-centered Islam?
I don't think we should come up with it. I think we should just start living it.
Yes.
You know, because if I walk down the street, it mustn't be because I look like Muslim, therefore I can be identified as Muslim. But I should be identified as Muslim because, if Allah is merciful, I'm merciful. If Allah is compassionate, I'm compassionate. If Allah is just, I'm a walking justice.
Yes,
know.
Just as a closing comment, the word fear came up quite often in the word faith, and I remember Imam using that in his last movie, The Radical. He chooses faith over fear. And I think we as queer individuals should make that conscious choice to choose faith over fear and not listen to these negative voices that come at us all the time.
For me, I always feel when at the point at which I was kind of distancing myself from Islam because I was starting to reconcile my faith with my sexuality, I think the main question I would always ask myself is, whatever acts I am doing, is it causing harm to anything else, to another human being, to an animal? Because I think that's the main question of Islam. Like, are you causing harm, or are you bringing peace and compassion, as Imam said earlier? And for me, that's when I look at kind of interpretations of Islam, I always ask myself, does that interpretation, does it promote healing? Does it promote compassion? Does it promote peace? And if it doesn't, then I need to question that interpretation.
It's easier to say that yes, choose faith over fear, but we're not saying that it's easy to not feel fear, because as I'm sitting here, I am worried. I am worried who's going to find out that about my sexual orientation. But at the same time, I am more proud of my sexual orientation and that I am Muslim and the fact that I'm doing something about it. Because I'm not going to wait 10 years down the line for someone else to come and do what we are doing. Because I've been living a life for so long. I've been oppressing myself because I've learned to oppress myself from the indoctrination. And for the first time ever, I don't want to, because I feel so close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now that I don't want anything or anybody to take that away from me. So whoever feels scared, It's okay.
Yeah, definitely.
I took a long time, we all took a long time, but here we are
Yes,
discussing, having conversations with one another.
absolutely.
Yeah, for me, I think this conversation is just reminding me of an Islamic teaching that says, "Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa Allah." That he who knows himself knows his God,
Yes,
his
yes.
Creator. And I think for us, especially as queer Muslims, we often look at the gatekeepers for answers, and we can clearly see that the gatekeepers don't have the answers for us. So let's go back to the source, and that means we are responsible then for our own knowledge seeking. And then find, often we look for God on the outside, but the more we can be authentic with ourselves, the more we become closer to Allah. So that would be my parting comment.
Thank you so much. It actually reminds me of something I've once read that says, you have to be queer to know God. And I took that and it was powerful for me, because it's funny how it's the queer people that actually feel so unaccepted that they actually go seeking for I don't know, some God,
Right.
Not knowing that it's the same God that we've always had with us. So yes, thank you so much to our viewers for watching, and catch us on our next video, Queer Muslim Women.